Welcome back to Echoes of Trust and Betrayal. Life has a way of presenting us with impossible choices, moments where doing the right thing will cause the most damage, and telling a lie becomes the only way to save the person you love. Today, we're looking into the life of a woman who faced a choice no mother should ever have to make. Before we dive into the shadows of this family, I want to ask you something. If you found out that the person your child looks up to most, their hero, their protector, was actually a monster, would you tell them the truth and watch their world shatter? Or would you become the villain in their story just to keep their innocence intact? At what point is a mother's reputation worth less than her child's peace of mind? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. How far would you go to be a shield for your child?
I remember the exact second my life split into two irreconcilable versions of the truth. The sanitized public version that the world would eventually come to believe, and the jagged, bleeding reality that I chose to bury beneath the floorboards of my soul. It was a Tuesday evening. It was quiet, ordinary, and aggressively normal. It was the kind of evening where the air is thick with the scent of a home-cooked dinner and the distant hum of a television. The kind of evening where you're supposed to feel safe. My husband, Adrian, had just walked through the front door, the familiar sound of his keys hitting the marble console echoing through the hallway like a sentence being passed. He looked exactly like the man I had loved for 2 decades. His tie loosened, his shoulders slumped from a long day at the firm, his face etched with a fatigue I thought I understood. But as he walked past me toward the stairs, I caught a glimpse of something behind his eyes that I didn't recognize. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was a flickering, frantic guilt, a shadow that didn't belong in the eyes of a man who supposedly had nothing to hide. I didn't recognize the darkness for what it was at first. I was too busy being a wife, too busy maintaining the perfect life we had curated in our suburban sanctuary. But Maya, my 19-year-old daughter, recognized it instantly. Maya had always been my soft place in a harsh world, the kind of child who possessed an emotional intelligence that was almost painful to witness. She noticed when a smile didn't reach your eyes. She felt the shift in a room's temperature before anyone else. That night, as we sat down for dinner, she wouldn't look at her father. She sat hunched over her plate, her long hair shielding her face like a curtain, her fork moving aimlessly through her food. The silence at the table wasn't just quiet, it was pressurized. It felt like we were all sitting on a fault line, waiting for the earth to open up. I watched Adrian try and make conversation, his voice a pitch too high, his laughter sounding like breaking glass. I thought maybe they had argued about her grades or her plans for the summer. I had no idea that I was watching the final moments of my daughter's peace. The unraveling truly began an hour later, after Maya had retreated to her room and Adrian had stepped into the garage to take a work call. He had left his phone on the kitchen counter, face up, a glowing rectangular ghost in the dim light of the stove. A notification pinged, a sharp digital chirp that sounded like a scream in the quiet house. I shouldn't have looked. I wasn't the kind of woman who checked her husband's messages. I believed in the privacy of our marriage. But something primal, something intuitive and terrifying forced my hand. I picked up the device, my fingers trembling as the screen lit up with a name I didn't recognize. But it was the message preview, just a few short, devastating words that made my heart stutter and then go completely still. I can't keep hiding this. She deserves to know. The room didn't spin. The walls didn't crumble. Instead, the world went dead still, as if the universe were holding its breath, waiting for me to realize the impossible. I scrolled up, my eyes burning as I read the history of a conversation I never should have seen. I saw the name again, and this time the recognition hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't a stranger. It was a betrayal so deep, so unnatural that my brain initially refused to process the information. Adrian had been mentoring a young woman, someone close to our family circle, and the messages revealed he had crossed a line that should have been a fortress. But then came the second blow, Maya's name mentioned in a context of manipulation. Adrian hadn't just had an affair, he had involved Maya in his lies, using her as a cover for his meetings, making her an accidental secret keeper for his darkness without her even realizing the weight of what she was witnessing. He had taken her trust, her need for a hero father, and her fragile 19-year-old heart, and he had twisted them into a tool for his own ego. In that moment, standing in my pristine kitchen, I realized that Adrian didn't just break our marriage, he had placed a ticking bomb in Maya's hands. If she ever truly saw him for the predator he was, if she realized her father was a monster, she would never recover. The truth would be the fire that consumed her, and as I heard her door creak open upstairs, I realized I had to be the one to jump into the flames first.
The confrontation didn't happen with a scream or a shattered glass. It happened in the suffocating stillness of 3 in the morning, in a kitchen that had suddenly turned into a courtroom. I had waited for Adrian to finish his call and come back inside, watching him through the window as he paced the driveway, a man who still thought he was in control of his own narrative. When he finally stepped back into the house, the smell of the cold night air clinging to his sweater, he found me sitting at the island, his phone placed directly in front of my chair. I didn't say a word. I just looked at him, and for the first time in 20 years, the man I had built a life with looked like a total stranger. I watched the realization hit him, the way his confident stride faltered, the way his jaw tightened, and finally, the way his eyes darted toward the phone. He didn't try to lie. He knew me too well for that. Instead, he simply slumped into the chair across from me, the weight of his own shadow finally catching up to him. "It's not what it looks like," he started, the classic opening line of a man drowning in his own deception. But I cut him off with a single sharp motion of my hand. I didn't want to hear the justifications or the excuses. I had read the messages. I had seen the way he had manipulated a girl half his age. And more importantly, I had seen how he had used Maya as a human shield for his extracurricular life. "You will leave this house," I told him, my voice coming out with a clinical, terrifying calmness that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "You will pack a bag, and you will disappear from our lives. No excuses, no apologies to her, and no goodbye lunches. You are a predator, Adrian, and I will not let you consume the only good thing we ever created." He looked up then, his face a mask of pathetic shame, but also a dawning terror. He knew that if the truth came out, if the community, his firm, and especially Maya saw the contents of that phone, his carefully curated life was over. But then the most agonizing realization of my life took hold. I thought about Maya. I thought about the way she looked at him with such pure, unadulterated pride. To her, Adrian wasn't just a father, he was the blueprint for what a good man should be. She was 19, standing on the fragile precipice of adulthood, still believing that the world was a place where heroes existed. If I told her the truth, if I handed her that phone, I wouldn't just be exposing a cheater, I would be destroying her faith in humanity. I would be telling her that the person she loved most in the world was capable of a betrayal so dark it defied logic. I saw the way she was already hurting, the way she was drowning in a confusion she couldn't name because she sensed something was wrong, but couldn't imagine her father was the cause. I realized in that moment that the truth wasn't a gift, it was a wrecking ball, and I was the only one who could stand in its path. I leaned forward, my hands flat on the cold marble, and I looked Adrian in the eye with a resolute that felt like iron. "I will never know what you did," I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. He looked confused, his eyes searching mine for the catch. "What are you talking about?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the next 10 years settling onto my shoulders. "I am going to take the blame," I said. "I will tell her, and I will tell everyone else that I was the one who was unfaithful.
I will be the one who broke this family. I will be the villain in her story so that she can keep her hero. He looked up then, his face a mask of pathetic shame, but also a dawning terror. He knew that if the truth came out, if the community, his firm, and especially Maya saw the contents of that phone, his carefully curated life was over.
The death of a reputation doesn't happen with a sudden blow. It's a slow, agonizing dismantling, 1,000 tiny cuts delivered by people you once called friends. Once the decision was made in the dead of that Tuesday night, the machinery of the lie began to grind. I watched Adrian pack his bags in a silence so heavy it felt like the walls were closing in on us. He didn't look at me as he zipped his suitcase, and I didn't look at him. There was no need for words anymore. We had signed a contract written in the blood of my dignity. When the front door finally clicked shut behind him, I didn't cry. I sat in the living room and watched the sunrise, knowing that this was the last morning I would ever be seen as a good woman in this town. I began the process of feeding the monster I had created. I didn't wait for the rumors to start. I planted the seeds myself. A vague post on social media about difficult transitions, a tearful, rehearsed phone call to my sister-in-law where I let the word mistake slip through my teeth, and a cold, distant demeanor when the neighbors asked where Adrian's car was. I became the architect of my own ruin, crafting a narrative of infidelity that was so believable because it was the only thing that made sense to a world that demanded a villain. The social isolation was immediate and surgical. It started with the group chats going silent, the digital equivalent of a room turning its back on you the moment you walk in. Then came the forgotten invitations to the Friday night dinners we had attended for a decade. I would see the photos later, the wine glasses clinking, the laughter, the empty chair where I used to sit, and I would feel a hollow ache in my chest that no amount of self-justification could soothe. When I walked down the street, I could feel the weight of their gazes, the sharp, judgmental eyes of women who had once shared their deepest secrets with me, now looking at me as if I were a contagion. They didn't see a mother protecting her child. They saw a wife who had grown bored, a woman who had stepped outside of a perfect marriage and destroyed a good man. I took it all. I leaned into the coldness, using it as a cloak. Every time someone looked away from me in the grocery store, I reminded myself that every ounce of hatred directed at me was a pound of protection for Maya. I was the lightning rod, drawing the storm away from the center of her world. But the hardest part wasn't the judgment of strangers. It was the quiet, agonizing shift in the atmosphere of our own home. Maya didn't scream at me when I confessed the sanitized version of the lie. She didn't throw things or call me names. Instead, she just drifted. She became a ghost in her own house, moving through the hallways with a fragile, glass-like stillness that broke my heart 1,000,000 times a day. She stopped coming into the kitchen for morning coffee. She stopped asking for my advice on her college papers. I could see the questions burning in her eyes, the why, that she was too hurt to even speak. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and profound, soul-deep disappointment, as if I were a stranger she had accidentally moved in with. I wanted to grab her by the shoulders and scream the truth. I wanted to tell her that her father was the one who had betrayed us, that he was the one who had used her as a prop in his sick games. But then I would look at the framed photo of them on the mantel, Adrian lifting her up at her high school graduation, both of them beaming with a pure, untainted love, and I would swallow the truth until it burned my throat. By the end of the first month, the execution was complete. Adrian had reluctantly moved into a sleek apartment downtown, playing the role of the jilted, heartbroken husband to perfection. He was receiving check-in texts and casseroles from our mutual friends, while I was left in a house that felt like a mausoleum. My reputation was a blackened, charred thing, a sacrifice I had laid at the altar of Maya's innocence. I sat in the dark living room listening to the sound of Maya crying softly in her room upstairs, and I realized that I had successfully saved her from the monster in her father,
But in doing so, I had become the monster in her mother. I had traded her respect for her peace, and as I watched the moon climb over the trees, I wondered if the silence was a price I could actually afford to pay for the rest of my life. I was a villain by choice, a shield by necessity, and the loneliest woman in the world by design.
If a reputation dies by 1,000 cuts, then a relationship dies in the quiet, microscopic spaces between words. As the months bled into a year, the vibrant, chaotic energy of our home, the shared jokes over burnt toast, the long debates about Maya's future, the comfortable hum of a house that knew it was loved, evaporated, replaced by a cold, sterile politeness. We moved around each other like two celestial bodies trapped in a dying orbit, close enough to feel the gravitational pull of our history, but too far apart to ever touch. I had built a wall of silence between us with my own hands, brick by brick, lie by lie, and now I was trapped behind it. Every time I walked into a room where Maya was sitting, she would reflexively tighten her posture, her shoulders tensing as if she were bracing for an impact. She didn't look at me with the fiery anger of a betrayed child. She looked at me with a hollowed-out disappointment that was infinitely worse. It was the look of someone who had realized their North Star was just a flickering, unreliable candle. The domestic rituals that used to be our glue became the site of my daily penance. I would make her favorite pasta, the scent filling the kitchen with memories of happier times, only for her to murmur a thanks without making eye contact and retreat to her room with her plate. I would try to ask about her classes, my voice desperate for a sliver of the connection we once had, and she would provide one-word answers that hit like stones. Fine. Good. Okay. She was 19, an age where she should have been leaning on me as she navigated the complexities of the world, but instead she was hardening herself against me. I watched her grow up through a glass partition. I could see her changing, see her becoming more guarded and less joyful, but I couldn't reach through to comfort her. I was the person who had broken the family. I was the one who had chosen someone else over her and Adrian. In her eyes, I was the architect of her pain, and every time she looked at the empty seat at the table where her hero father used to sit, I saw the resentment deepen in the set of her jaw. The most agonizing part was watching her seek solace in the very man I was protecting her from. Adrian played his role with a sickening, virtuoso precision. He would pick her up for weekend brunches, appearing on the doorstep with the sad, dignified smile of a man who had been wronged, but was trying his best to be a good father. I would watch from the window as she threw her arms around him, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing left in her world. I saw him pat her hair, his face a mask of faux sympathy, and I would have to grip the windowsill until my knuckles turned white to keep from screaming the truth through the glass. He was her sanctuary, her safe place, the only parent who hadn't lied to her. He was reaping the rewards of my sacrifice, basking in the glow of her adoration while I rotted in the shadow of her judgment. He knew I wouldn't break. He knew that my love for Maya was his greatest shield, and he used it with a cold, calculated efficiency that made my blood run cold. One evening, I found her in the living room, staring at an old photo of the three of us on a hiking trip years ago. She didn't hear me come in. She was tracing the outline of my face in the picture with a look of such profound confusion and hurt that I almost crumbled right there. "Why, Mom?" she whispered, not realizing I was behind her. Why wasn't he enough? Why weren't we enough? I stood in the shadows of the hallway, the words I wanted to say, the real words, choking me. I wanted to tell her that I did it for her. I wanted to tell her that her father was a ghost, a hollow man who had used her as an alibi. But instead, I just retreated into the darkness, leaving her alone with her questions. I realized then that I hadn't just taken the blame for an affair, I had taken the blame for the destruction of her childhood.
I had become the villain so she could keep her fairy tale. But the cost was a wall of silence that felt like it was made of lead. I was her mother, her protector, and her greatest enemy, all wrapped into one silent, breaking heart.
Time doesn't heal a lie. It only petrifies it, turning a soft deception into a jagged, unbreakable stone. A decade crawled by, marked not by milestones of shared joy, but by the steady, rhythmic ticking of a clock in an increasingly empty house. Maya grew up. She graduated, landed her first high-pressure job in the city, fell in love, and eventually planned a wedding. But she didn't do those things with me. I watched her life unfold through the grainy lens of social media posts and the occasional stilted phone call that lasted exactly 5 minutes, just long enough for her to fulfill her daughterly duty without having to actually engage with the woman she believed had betrayed her father. I became the difficult mother, the one who was invited to the ceremony but not the dress shopping, the one who sat in the third row instead of the first, the one who was a ghost at her own daughter's celebration of love. Every year on her birthday, I would sit at the kitchen table with a card I knew she would barely read, my pen hovering over the paper. I wanted to write the truth. I wanted to tell her that every time she hugged her father, who had remarried a woman 15 years younger and was living a reformed life of luxury, she was hugging a hollow shell. Adrian had played the long game to perfection. He had moved on, his reputation intact, his unfortunate first marriage now just a sympathetic footnote in his biography. He was the devoted father who had stayed strong for her daughter after her mother's indiscretion. I watched him at Maya's engagement party, clinking glasses with her fiancé, his face a mask of grandfatherly wisdom. I saw the way Maya looked at him, with a devotion that was absolute, a love that was untainted by the knowledge of what he truly was. My sacrifice had worked. She was happy. She was stable. She believed in the goodness of men because I had let her believe her father was one. But the cost to my own soul was a slow, crushing weight that made it hard to draw a full breath. I had lived as a social pariah for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to be looked at without pity or disgust. My old friends had long since stopped calling, and my family treated me like a fragile, broken thing that was better left unaddressed. I lived in a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence in the house. I would walk through the rooms and see the ghosts of who we used to be, the little girl who used to think I was a superhero, the teenager who used to tell me everything. Now she was a woman who barely knew me. I was the mistake she had to move past. I realized that by protecting her innocence, I had effectively deleted myself from her life. I was a footnote in her story, the villain who was necessary for the plot but wasn't invited to the happy ending. On the eve of her wedding, Maya came to the house to pick up some old childhood mementos. It was the first time she had been inside the kitchen in years. She stood there, looking at the marble island, the place where the world had ended on that Tuesday night, and for a second I saw a flicker of the old Maya in her eyes. "Are you happy, Mom?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. "Was it worth it? Whatever you found out there, was it worth breaking everything?" I looked at her, my heart breaking for the millionth time. I wanted to scream that she was what was out there, that her peace was what was worth it. But I just smiled that same tired, practiced smile and said, "Sometimes we make choices we can't take back, Maya. I just want you to be happy." She nodded, a cold, distant look returning to her face as she turned to leave. I watched her car pull out of the driveway, and I realized that I had successfully carried the weight of the truth for 10 years. But as the house settled into its familiar, oppressive silence, I wondered if I would survive the next 10.
I was a shield that was starting to crack, and the truth was a fire that was getting harder and harder to contain.
The truth has a way of breathing, even when you bury it under a decade of silence and stone. It waits in the dark, patient and cold, until the very moment you think you finally moved past it. For 10 years, I had kept a secret that was slowly eroding my soul, but I had also kept a record of it. A letter I wrote in the middle of a feverish, sobbing night just weeks after Adrian left. I never intended for Maya to see it. It was my ghost-written confession, a way to vent the poison out of my system so it wouldn't kill me. I had tucked it inside her old baby book, hidden behind a photo of her first steps, thinking it was the safest place in the world because she hadn't looked at that book since she was 12. But weddings have a way of making people reach for the past. 2 weeks before she was set to walk down the aisle, Maya came to the house while I was out running errands. She wanted her old something old, a lace handkerchief my mother had given her. She knew it was in the attic, tucked away in one of the trunks that held the remnants of our broken family. I came home to a silence that was different from the usual coldness of the house. It wasn't the silence of an empty room. It was the vibrating electric silence of a shattered illusion. I walked into the living room and saw her. She was sitting on the floor, surrounded by the ghosts of her childhood, old drawings, school trophies, and the baby book. The book was open on her lap, the binding cracked, and in her hand was the heavy cream-colored envelope. My breath hitched in my throat, a sharp, jagged pain that felt like a physical blow. I didn't have to ask if she had read it. I could see the wreckage in her eyes, the way the light had gone out of them, replaced by a searing, agonizing clarity. She didn't look like a bride-to-be in that moment. She looked like the 19-year-old girl from that Tuesday night, drowning in a truth she wasn't prepared to swim in. The letter didn't just explain the affair. It laid out the manipulation, the messages, and the specific ways Adrian had used her innocence to protect his own skin. "Is this a lie, Mom?" she whispered, her voice so thin it was barely a thread of sound in the large, quiet room. She didn't look up at me. Her gaze was fixed on the handwriting, the ink blurred in places where my tears had hit the page a decade ago. I stood in the doorway, my grocery bags slipping from my hands and hitting the floor with a dull thud. I wanted to lie again. I wanted to snatch the paper and burn it, to tell her it was a work of fiction, a bitter fantasy I had created to cope with my own guilt. But the words died in my throat. I looked at her, at the raw, bleeding wound of her expression, and I realized that the shield had finally failed. I had spent 10 years being a villain to keep her safe, but the truth is a predator that eventually finds its way through the cracks. "Maya," I started, my voice breaking, "I never wanted you to find that. It was supposed to stay in the dark." She finally looked up, and the intensity of her gaze made me flinch. It wasn't the disappointment I had lived with for years. It was a profound, soul-shattering realization of the man her father really was. "All those years," she said, her voice rising, shaking with a fury that was directed at the air itself. "All those years I hated you. I treated you like a stranger. I let him play the hero while you sat in this house alone. And you let me do it. You let me hate you." She stood up, the letter fluttering to the floor like a fallen wing. The weight of the decade we had lost, the missed coffee dates, the stilted phone calls, the cold weddings, suddenly crashed down on both of us. I had saved her from the monster in her father, but I had handed her a different kind of trauma, the realization that her mother had been a martyr, and she had been the executioner. As she turned and ran out of the house, leaving the door swinging wide to the cold afternoon air, I realized that the truth hadn't set us free. It had just changed the nature of the fire. The day of the wedding arrived not with the soft glow of a fairy tale,
but with the suffocating pressure of a storm about to break. I sat in the third row, dressed in a muted navy silk that felt like a shroud, my hands folded so tightly in my lap that my knuckles were white. The air in the stone chapel was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the hushed, excited chatter of the town's elite, the same people who had whispered about my shame for a decade. Across the aisle sat Adrian's new family, looking polished and perfect, while he stood at the back of the church adjusting his cufflinks with the practiced ease of a man who believed he had finally gotten away with everything. He didn't know about the letter. He didn't know that the foundation of his second life was currently dissolving under the weight of a yellowed piece of paper. I watched him through a haze of grief, wondering if I had made the ultimate mistake, if by keeping her safe for 10 years, I had only ensured that the explosion would be 10 times more destructive when it finally came. Then the music shifted. The heavy, resonant chords of the organ filled the space, and the heavy oak doors at the back of the sanctuary swung open. Maya appeared, framed by the bright afternoon light, a vision of lace and tulle that should have been the happiest moment of my life. But as she began the long walk down the aisle, she wasn't looking at her fiancé at the altar. She wasn't looking at the guests. Her eyes were fixed on Adrian, who had stepped forward to meet her halfway, his face glowing with the pride of a devoted father. I saw the moment their eyes met, the split second where Adrian's smile faltered, replaced by a flickering, instinctive confusion. He saw something in Maya's gaze that wasn't there yesterday. He saw a cold, clinical recognition. He saw the girl from the ravine, the girl from the messages, and the daughter who finally knew his name. She reached him, but she didn't take his arm. The music continued, but the atmosphere in the church shifted instantly. The guests began to murmur, the sound a low, rising hum of confusion. Maya stood perfectly still, her bouquet trembling in her hands, her voice carrying through the quiet sanctuary with a sharp, crystalline clarity. "Don't touch me," she whispered, but in the silence of the stone hall, it sounded like a shout. Adrian's face went a sickly, translucent gray, his hand frozen in midair. "Maya, honey, what are you—" he started, his voice a frantic, hushed hiss. But she didn't let him finish. She reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out the crinkled, tear-stained letter, the one I had hidden, the one she had found. She didn't throw it, she didn't scream, she simply held it up between them, a white flag of surrender for the lie they had both lived in for 10 years. The hero finally crumbled. I watched as Adrian's shoulders slumped, the facade of the pillar of the community evaporating in the light of the stained glass. He looked around the room, at his new wife, at his business partners, at the people who had toasted to his resilience, and he realized that the cage had finally closed. Maya turned her head then, her eyes finding mine in the third row. There was no more disappointment there, no more pity. There was only a raw, agonizing apology that spanned a decade of silence. She realized that every gray hair on my head, every lonely night in that house, and every cold look she had given me was a debt I had paid to keep her world whole. The wedding didn't happen that day. The music stopped, the guests were asked to leave, and the perfect family collapsed under the weight of the truth. As I stood up to meet her in the aisle, I realized that the sacrifice was over. The shield had broken, but for the first time in 10 years, we were both standing in the light.
The silence of a collapsed life is different from the silence of a hidden one. It isn't heavy or suffocating. It's hollow, like the air inside an empty cathedral after the choir has left. As the guests filtered out of the church in a daze of hushed whispers and sidelong glances, the perfect world of Adrian's second life disintegrated in real time. I watched from the shadows of the vestibule as his new wife, the woman who had replaced me with the ease of a software update, walked away from him without a word, her heels clicking a sharp, final rhythm on the stone floor. Adrian was left standing at the altar alone, the white lilies surrounding him like a funeral arrangement for his reputation. He didn't look at me. He didn't even look at Maya. He looked at the floor, a man who had finally run out of alibis, realizing that the crazy ex-wife narrative he had sold to the world had just been set on fire by the one person he couldn't manipulate, his daughter. Maya didn't cry, not then. She moved with a strange robotic precision, gathering the heavy train of her dress and walking past the pews toward the back of the church where I stood. She didn't say a word as she reached me. She simply took my hand, her fingers cold as ice, and led me out to the parking lot. We got into my car, the same reliable, unassuming sedan I had driven for years, and I started the engine. We drove away from the chapel, away from the tuxedoed men and the bewildered bridesmaids, and we didn't stop until we reached the overlook at the edge of town, the place where you can see the entire valley stretched out like a map of a life you used to know. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and defiant oranges, and finally, the dam broke. "I hated you for 3,652 days, she whispered, her voice cracking on the final number. She was staring at her hands, the engagement ring looking like a heavy, gilded shackle. "I spent 10 years thinking you were the reason I didn't have a home anymore. I spent every holiday, every graduation, every milestone feeling sorry for him because I thought he was the victim. And all that time, you were just holding the ceiling up while I threw stones at you." I reached out, my own hand trembling, and I covered hers. I wanted to tell her it was okay, that I would do it all again, but that would have been another lie. It wasn't okay. It was a tragedy that we had lost a decade of our lives to a predator's comfort. I had saved her innocence, but I had sacrificed our intimacy. And as I looked at the woman she had become, a woman who now carried the same heavy, jagged truth I did, I realized that my mercy had been its own kind of cruelty. We sat there for a long time, the car growing cold as the stars began to needle through the dark. We talked about Adrian, not the hero father, but the man in the messages. We talked about the legal fallout that was coming, the calls to the firm, and the inevitable social explosion that would follow. But mostly we talked about the silence. Maya told me about the nights she wanted to call me but didn't, because she felt she had to be loyal to the father I had supposedly betrayed. I told her about the letters I had written and burned, the way I had watched her from a distance, and how every cold look she gave me had felt like a necessary penance. We weren't healed. That's a word for people who haven't seen the bones of their own history. But we were finally honest. As I put the car in gear to drive her home, to my home, the house where the secret had lived for so long, I realized that the truth didn't set us free in the way the stories say. It didn't bring back the lost years or erase the scars, but it gave us a foundation that wasn't made of sand. We were starting over, two women with nothing left but the truth, finally ready to walk the long, hard road back to being a mother and a daughter.
Thank you for staying with us through this devastating journey of love, sacrifice, and the ultimate cost of a mother's protection. This story reminds us that while a lie can shield someone from the rain, it can also drown them in the flood when the dam finally breaks. If this story moved you, or if it made you rethink the secrets you're carrying for the people you love, please like this video and share it with someone who understands that love isn't always about telling the truth. Sometimes it's about being the only one who knows it. We are building a community here at Echoes of Trust and Betrayal, where we confront the hardest parts of human connection. So please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new chapter. Before we go, I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think the narrator made the right choice to stay silent for 10 years? Or did she steal 10 years of a real relationship from her daughter? And now that the truth is out, can they ever truly recover? Let's talk about it below. Until next time, remember, the things we bury always find a way to grow. We'll see you in the next episode.